Somewhere inside the South Carolina Historical Society archives, there is a document sealed against daylight. It bears a date, March 1847, and a warning written with the kind of careful piety that feels less like faith and more like fear. Testimony too disturbing for public record. May God forgive what men have done. Inside those brittle, yellowed pages lies the sworn account of 8 plantation owners. Over the span of 11 years, each suffered the same injury. Each was castrated with a precision that the men who wrote the testimony could not bring themselves to describe in full. Each attack occurred within a single day of a certain act, an act so common in the Low Country that it rarely earned a name, and so unspeakable that it could not be admitted aloud. The perpetrator was never officially caught, never identified in the clean, confident language of the law. But after the Civil War, when the old order began to crack and freed people finally spoke in rooms where they could not be sold for it, whispers traveled through the Low Country like smoke. They spoke of a man called Silas the Silent, a field hand who could not scream, a man whose vocal cords had been ruined beyond repair, and who returned a kind of justice so methodical, so terrifying, that even those who should have cheered it learned to keep his name behind their teeth. What you're about to hear is a reconstruction of events that authorities in South Carolina deliberately blurred, softened, and buried. A pattern of violence so unsettling that it became easier to pretend it never happened than to confront what it revealed about the plantation system itself. Before we step into the story of Silas and the 8 men who entered his careful fury, I need to ask you something. This channel exists for the darkest true stories in American history, the ones that never make it into the classroom, the ones that sit under polite narratives like rot beneath fresh paint. If you want more documentaries like this, subscribe now and tell me where you're listening from. Drop your city or your state in the comments. Now, let's descend. The sealed testimony wasn't uncovered by accident. It took persistence. One graduate student in 2003 refusing to accept that a warning label meant the story beneath it should remain untouched. She fought through permissions, denials, and the slow bureaucracy of old institutions guarding old shame. And when she finally read the pages, what she found stayed with her for years. To understand what happened, you have to picture the South Carolina Low Country in 1836. A landscape of contradictions so sharp they feel unreal. Sunlit water, tidal rivers, live oaks draped in moss. Beauty so effortless, it can make you forget what it was built upon. The rice plantations generated enormous wealth for a small class of white landowners, and every grain of it came from forced labor. Thousands of enslaved African-Americans worked in mosquito-thick fields, where malaria and dysentery killed as readily as exhaustion did. Charleston, 40 miles to the east, wore its civilized mask. Grand balls, literary societies, churches with bright steeples, and hymns that rose clean into the air. But beyond that, cities' manners stretched an interconnected network of labor camps where human beings were bought, sold, bred, and worked until they broke. The plantation belt ran along the coastal plain, where tidal rivers and rich soil made rice grow thick and profitable. But rice demanded punishment. Enslaved workers stood knee-deep in water for hours, open to snakes, alligators, infection, disease. Sharp-edged stalks tore their hands until they stayed raw and bloody. Summer brought suffocating heat, air heavy with humidity and insects. Winter brought cold rain that soaked thin cloth and left bodies shivering through the night. On many plantations, The enslaved population outnumbered the enslavers by 20 or 30 to 1. That imbalance did not soften anything. It created a permanent atmosphere of dread among white owners, an awareness, always present, that the people they held in chains could have ended them if they ever moved together. So the fear became policy. Discipline was not simply control. It was theater, surveillance systems, random punishments. Patrol riders moving through the roads at night, armed men checking papers, hunting down anyone black who wasn't where they were supposed to be. The brutality wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the mechanism that kept the system breathing. Into this world, sometime around 1815, a child was born and given the name Silas. His mother, according to fragmentary records, was named Patience, a field woman on the Ruddled Plantation near Georgetown. His father was never named. But in the same ledger where her name appears, another note appears like a cold fingerprint. Patience's child was mulatto, which meant the father was white. In the rigid caste system of plantation society, that detail mattered. Children born to enslaved mothers and white fathers were legally enslaved through their mother's status, yet their faces carried the features of their oppressors. Those features did not protect them. Often, they marked them for resentment, for attention, for a particular kind of possession that went beyond labor. Silas grew up in the quarters, crowded wooden structures that barely deserved to be called housing. They leaked when it rained. They baked in summer. They offered little warmth in winter. Privacy was a myth. Families could be broken on the whim of debt or convenience. Children sold away from parents. Husbands from wives. The psychological toll of living inside that instability cannot be measured, only felt. And still, within those narrow walls, people built what they could. Networks of support, African traditions braided with Christian teaching, songs carrying coded messages of resistance, small, stubborn rituals of humanity in a system designed to strip it away. By 7, Silas was in the fields. Plantation records from the Ruddled estate list him in 1822 as field hand small tasks. By 10, he was doing adult labor. Decades later, in oral histories gathered by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s, survivors remembered him as quiet even in childhood. Not merely shy, quiet in a way that felt watchful. One elderly, formerly enslaved person interviewed in 1937 recalled, "My granddaddy told me about a boy named Silas, who never spoke much, even as a little child. Had light skin and gray eyes that looked right through you. Said that boy saw things other children didn't see. Remembered things it was safer to forget." The Low Country already had a reputation for exceptional cruelty, even among other slave states. The demographics made enslavers paranoid, especially after the Denmark-Vizid conspiracy of 1822, when Charleston authorities claimed to uncover a plot for a massive uprising. Historians still argue about what was real and what was manufactured, but the response was very real. 35 black men were hanged. Restrictions tightened like a noose. Patrols intensified. Literacy, already illegal, became more aggressively policed. Religious gatherings without white supervision were banned. The message was simple. Resistance would be met with overwhelming violence. It was into that pressure cooker that Silas entered adolescence. He was 13 in 1828 when something happened that changed him permanently. The exact details are unclear. That kind of detail rarely survived, because the act itself was supposed to be silent, and the victim was expected to carry it in his body and never in words. But the Ruddled Plantation records show that in October of that year, Silas was treated by a doctor for severe throat injuries. The medical note is brief, clinical, almost merciful in how little it says. Slave boy, approximately 13 years. Damage to larynx and vocal cords. Cause undetermined. Recommended observation. Another entry appears in a different hand, colder in its casualness. Silas unable to work, recovering from discipline incident. Discipline. A word that could cover anything. Whipping, branding, mutilation. The erasure of a person in pieces. From that point onward, Silas could not speak normally. Later accounts say he could make sounds, grunts, whispers, sometimes a strangled attempt at words, but his voice was ruined, permanent. And so Silas the Silent began to move through plantation life as something both invisible and deeply unsettling. His inability to speak made him seem harmless to some overseers and disturbing to others. A man who could not cry out, a man who could not testify, a man who could not name what was done to him. The Ruddled Plantation, like many in the region, ran on a task system. Enslaved workers were given a set amount of work each day: rice to thresh, ditches to dig, fields to hoe. When a task was completed, time was theirs. In practice, tasks were often designed to swallow the daylight and force labor into the evening. But the system still created small pockets of autonomy. Garden plots, fishing in the rivers, surplus produce sold for tiny amounts of money. Small freedoms, but crucial for survival. Silas used those hours differently than most. He watched, he listened. His silence made people forget he was there, and in that forgettability, he learned. He learned which overseers drank themselves soft, which ones disappeared into the quarters at night. He learned patrol schedules, the gaps in their routes, the times the road went dark and unguarded. He learned who visited whom and why. And he learned, without anyone ever saying it plainly, which plantation owners treated enslaved women and sometimes enslaved boys as sexual property, as a right that came with ownership. The first incident happened on a humid night in August 1836, though its significance would only become clear later. The victim was Nathaniel Grayson, 32, owner of a plantation bordering the Ruddled estate. At dawn, his wife found him in their bed, conscious but in shock, blood soaking through the sheets. He had been castrated with what the doctor described, reluctantly, as almost surgical precision. The bedroom door was locked from the inside. Windows were shuttered and latched. There was no sign of forced entry. No evidence of a struggle beyond the injury itself. When Grayson could speak, he said he woke to a hand over his mouth, a flash of metal. Then pain so immense he blacked out. He saw nothing, heard nothing, except breathing, steady, controlled breathing. Sheriff Benjamin Carr investigated with the help of the Slave Patrol. Every enslaved person on Grayson's property was questioned. Several were whipped on suspicion, less to extract truth than to remind everyone of the cost of existing. Nothing useful emerged. Grayson's wife insisted no enslaved person had been inside the house that night. House servants confirmed they'd been locked in their quarters at nightfall, as usual. Within days, the investigation stalled. White society whispered theories, revenge, abolition conspiracies, a runaway with a knife and a grudge, but no arrest was made, and a detail went unrecorded for a reason that was older than law. The previous afternoon, a field hand from the neighboring Ruddled plantation, Silas, had been loaned to Grayson to help with repairs to a rice mill. Temporary transfers like that were common, a kind of mutual assistance between owners. The work ran late. Instead of sending Silas back in darkness, Grayson kept him overnight in a storage shed near the main house. At around 10 that evening, Grayson visited that shed. He stayed for roughly half an hour. When he emerged, adjusting his clothing, Silas came out behind him, moving slowly, face unreadable. Grayson told his overseer to return Silas to the Ruttles plantation at first light. It was the last coherent order he gave before the attack. No connection was made, because to make it would require Grayson to explain why he visited the shed late at night. And to explain that would be to speak aloud a truth that everyone understood and no one admitted. In the honor culture of the planter class, some realities were treated like poison, common, expected, and never named. So Grayson suffered in silence. He told others it had been an unknown intruder, perhaps a runaway who somehow slipped into a locked room. His reputation stayed intact, and Silas returned to the Ruttles plantation, worked in the fields, said nothing because he could say nothing. His face showed no emotion. Life continued. 18 months passed. Then, in February 1838, it happened again. The second incident struck in February 1838, when the air over the flooded fields carried that particular winter chill, wet, bone-deep, the kind that makes even the strongest bodies feel hollow. This time the victim was Thomas Wainwright, 41, owner of a medium-sized plantation 12 miles south of Rutland Land. Married, 4 children. A man who sat in church with a straight spine and a calm face, who gave public prayers as if God had never watched him closely. He was found not in his bed, but in the plantation office, an outbuilding kept separate from the main house. His overseer discovered him near midnight, slumped on the floor, trousers dark with blood. The injury was the same. The precision was the same. The quiet cruelty of the act felt almost identical, as though the attacker had rehearsed it until the movements lived in his hands. The office door was bolted from the inside. Wainwright survived, but only barely. He drifted in and out of consciousness for days. When he could speak, he offered nothing useful. He claimed he remembered no face, no voice, no struggle, only that he had been working late over account books, and then pain erupted in his body like fire. Sheriff Carr investigated again. For the first time, the resemblance to the Grayson case was impossible to ignore. 2 plantation owners, 2 locked rooms, 2 identical mutilations, 2 men left alive, but ruined. Theories began to multiply like flies. An organized slave uprising, abolitionists, a gang moving through the Low Country with a grudge against the planter class, a disturbed individual stalking men of wealth, anything that could be imagined, so long as it did not require looking directly at what these men did in darkness. As before, the investigation turned toward enslaved people, men who had shown intelligence, independence, any hint of a spine. Several were arrested, interrogated, beaten, held for weeks, then released when nothing could be proven. Their suffering was treated as collateral, an acceptable expense of keeping white fear quiet. And again, a detail went unspoken. 2 days before the attack, Wainwright had traveled to Georgetown for business. There, he negotiated a short-term rental of a skilled carpentry worker. The Ruttles plantation, eager for extra income, had begun renting out some of their more useful, enslaved laborers for temporary projects. Silas was among them. Despite his silence, he had learned carpentry. He was considered competent, efficient, and perhaps because he could not speak, he was treated as safe, like a tool that could not betray its owner. Silas was sent to Wainwright's plantation to repair damage to several outbuildings. The work lasted 3 days. He slept alone in a locked tool shed. Meals were brought to him by the cook. He worked from dawn until the light failed. On the second evening, Wainwright visited that shed. He stayed for some time. When he left, Silas remained inside. The next day, Silas finished his work and returned to Rutland Land. The day after that, Wainwright was found castrated in his locked office. No connection was made because no one was looking for one. Within the white worldview, an enslaved person, especially one who could not speak, who could not cry out, who could not even describe what had been done to him, was not imagined as someone capable of planning, of strategy, of waiting. They were property, objects, labor, bodies without agency. The possibility that a man like Silas could respond with methodical violence simply did not exist in the mental architecture of plantation society. But among the enslaved communities, something began to move. Not a declaration, not a chant, nothing so obvious, just whispers, a careful quiet that meant, "We know." A pattern of glances held too long, conversations that stopped when certain footsteps approached, names spoken only in pieces, as if full syllables could summon danger. An elderly woman interviewed decades later remembered it like weather. "We knew there was somebody making those white men pay. Didn't know for certain who, but there was talk about a man who couldn't speak, who moved like a shadow. People were scared of him, but not the way you'd be scared of something evil. More like how you'd be scared of a storm. You know it's coming. You know it's powerful, and you just try to stay out of its way." By 1840, 4 plantation owners in the Low Country had suffered the same fate: Nathaniel Grayson, Thomas Wainwright, and now Edmund Talbot and Henry Prescott. On the surface, they seemed unconnected. Different ages, different levels of wealth, different social circles. But geography tethered them together like a chain. All lived within a 20-mile radius, tied into the same rice economy, the same river systems, the same culture of silence. The attacks created a new kind of fear among the planter class, something personal, intimate, and humiliating. Locked doors no longer felt like protection. The presence of enslaved people inside the home, once taken for granted as part of the machine, began to feel like living beside a sleeping predator. Some owners slept with pistols under pillows. Others added locks, hired extra overseers, tightened discipline until it became openly sadistic. Slave patrols rode harder at night, stopping any black person on the roads, demanding passes, demanding obedience, demanding reassurance that they still controlled the shape of the world. But the attacks continued, unpredictable in timing, consistent in method. And what those plantation owners could not see, because they had never truly seen the enslaved as human, was that Silas had been present on each property in the days immediately before each mutilation. The Rutland Estates rental business had quietly placed him at the center of a pattern that white society refused to track. Silas would arrive at a plantation, work with steady diligence, sleep where he was assigned, often a shed or storage building separate from the main quarters, and finish his tasks efficiently. And on some of those plantations, not all, but enough, the owner would visit him at night. What happened during those visits was never written down. It existed only in the private hell of the one who endured it, and in the cold memory of the one who counted it. Then Silas returned to Rutland Land, and within 48 hours, the man who had visited him would be found castrated, often in a room locked from the inside. The act executed with such quiet speed that even a wife in the same house might sleep through it. The investigations stayed fragmented, each incident treated as isolated, each handled by local authorities who barely coordinated with neighboring jurisdictions. Sheriff Carr began to suspect he was facing a serial attacker. He pushed for a broader inquiry. He met resistance, Plantation owners did not want to discuss the attacks openly. Shame sat heavy beneath their silk and their Sunday manners, and there was fear too. Fear that publicity would inspire other acts. Fear that acknowledging vulnerability would weaken the illusion of absolute control. Fear that the wrong question, spoken aloud, might crack the entire structure. Newspapers offered brief, carefully sanitized notices. Violent incident. Unknown assailant. No details. In the enslaved quarters, a different kind of truth moved. One that could not be recorded, only carried. People understood which men were being targeted. They understood that whatever this was, it resembled the justice their legal system would never grant them. Enslaved women, especially those forced into repeated violation by white men, spoke in coded language about the silent one who made men pay. But celebration was dangerous. After each attack, slave patrols swept through the region, interrogating people, smashing possessions, beating bodies at random to reassert control. Punishment did not require proof. It only required fear. So knowledge stayed underground, whispered, hidden, passed like contraband. Silas remained an enigma even to those who lived beside him on the Ruddled plantation. He worked, he ate, he slept, he had no family. His mother Patience had died of fever in 1830. He had never known siblings. He formed no close friendships. He participated minimally in the small communal life of the quarters. His silence was both explanation and wall. How do you build closeness with someone who cannot speak? With a man whose face offers no easy emotion, whose eyes seem to look through you rather than at you? An elderly man named Joshua, interviewed in 1936, put it like this: Silas wasn't like other folks. Something happened to him when he was young. Something that broke him inside even more than it broke his voice. He'd work all day in the heat, cutting rice until his hands bled, and he wouldn't make a sound. Overseers liked that at first, thought he was broken good, but there was something in his eyes that made smart people nervous. He was watching, always watching, like he was seeing things the rest of us couldn't see. And when he looked at certain white men, there was something in that look that made you think of deep water, the kind that drowns you slow. The Ruddled plantation owners never suspected him. He was valuable property, skilled, rentable, quiet. His inability to speak made him seem safer, incapable of rumor, incapable of organizing resistance, incapable even of crying out if something happened to him. In their eyes, he was the ideal slave, productive, obedient, and controlled. But control was an illusion. Silas understood the rhythms of plantation life better than the men who claimed to own it. He knew the patterns of white movement and black restriction. He knew where he was expected to be and how to vanish inside expectation. He knew that his silence made him vulnerable, but it also made him forgettable. Overseers spoke freely around him, assuming he could not carry secrets. White men used him and erased him from their minds, convinced that a mute slave could never become a threat. They were catastrophically wrong. By 1842, the count reached 6. 2 more plantation owners, Robert Finch and Charles Hammond, were found with the same injury, the same locked room mystery, the same survivor's silence afterward. Now even the papers began to strain under the weight of denial. The Charleston Mercury published an editorial calling for coordinated investigation, suggesting an individual or organization was targeting the plantation class. Rewards were offered. The governor authorized militia support. And still, the investigation stumbled in the same circle because the victims refused, almost without exception, to speak of certain hours, certain details, certain visits. None would admit what they had been doing before the attacks. None would acknowledge which enslaved workers had been on their property, because to do so would mean naming the unspoken truth that held the entire society together. A man might assault enslaved women and boys with impunity, but to admit it publicly, openly in the language of testimony, was to risk reputation, standing, power. Better to suffer in silence than to confess the nature of your appetite. That silence protected Silas more effectively than any hiding place ever could. The pattern was there, sharp as a blade, waiting to be seen. But no one with authority was willing to look in the direction that would reveal what the planter class could not afford to acknowledge. And so the attacks continued, each one a deliberate act of retaliation that left its victim alive, but permanently altered. Then, unexpectedly, a witness emerged. Her name was Denina, a house servant on the Hammond plantation. And on the night Charles Hammond was attacked, she saw something she could not unsee. Denina was 34 years old in 1842, a woman who had lived her entire life inside bondage. She had been sold twice, once as a child when her first owner died, once as a young woman when a plantation collapsed under debt. By the time she arrived at the Hammond plantation, she had learned what survival required: observation without reaction, memory without comment. As a house servant, her position was both privileged and dangerous. Better food, cleaner clothes, less backbreaking labor. But proximity to white families came with its own kind of terror. House servants saw too much, heard arguments, confessions, cruelty carried out behind closed doors. Knowledge was a liability. To witness the wrong thing at the wrong time could get you beaten, sold, or killed. On the night Charles Hammond was attacked, Denina slept in a small room off the kitchen, as was customary for the cook and primary house servant. Around 2 a.m, she woke to use the chamber pot and heard something that made her freeze. A footstep, not loud, not careless. A slow, testing sound on the staircase that led to the second floor where the bedrooms were kept. The house was old. Certain steps creaked predictably. Denina knew those sounds intimately. What she heard was someone moving with care, adjusting weight to avoid noise. Every instinct told her to stay where she was, to know nothing, to see nothing. But curiosity, or something deeper, pulled her to the doorway. She lit a single candle, shielding its glow with her hand, and edged forward until she could see the stairs. A figure stood at the top, lean, male, moving with deliberate calm toward Hammond's bedroom. For a moment, Denina thought she was witnessing murder. Her heart slammed so hard she thought it might give her away. Then the figure turned slightly, and candlelight caught his face for just an instant. She recognized him. Silas, the carpenter from the Ruttled plantation. He had been working on the property for 3 days, repairing railings and window frames. Everyone believed he was locked in the tool shed each night. Clearly, he was not. Denina watched, rooted in place, as Silas reached Hammond's bedroom door. She expected it to resist. Hammond locked his door every night now, frightened by rumors of the attacks. The door opened without sound. Silas slipped inside. The door closed. Denina stood there, breathing shallowly, trapped between duty and terror. She could raise an alarm, wake the house, save a white man's life, or she could do nothing. What stopped her may never be fully known. Perhaps it was memory, the way Hammond visited the quarters, selecting women with casual entitlement. Perhaps it was understanding, or perhaps it was the recognition that whatever was about to happen was a reckoning the law would never allow. She returned to her room. She lay awake until dawn. The house stayed quiet. No struggle, no screams, only a silence so complete it felt intentional. When Hammond's moans began just before first light, Danina was already in the kitchen, lighting the fire, preparing breakfast as she always did. She witnessed the chaos that followed. The doctor summoned, the wife screaming, the sheriff questioning everyone in clipped, anxious tones. Danina said nothing. Silence, once taken into the body, has weight. She carried what she knew through the rest of 1842 and into 1843. She watched Silas when he returned to the Hammond plantation for more work. She felt certain he knew she had seen him. They shared a knowledge that could destroy them both. The seventh attack came in November 1843. The victim was Daniel Merrick, a plantation owner so brutal that even neighboring planters spoke of him with discomfort. Merrick owned a large rice operation near the Waccamaw River and ruled it through terror. Whippings for minor infractions, thumbscrews, the stocks. People worked until they collapsed. Some did not get back up. Merrick's appetites were well known. Silas was sent to Merrick's plantation to build a new storage structure. 10 days of work. He slept alone in a locked corn crib. On the third night, Merrick visited him. 9 days later, Merrick was found castrated in his office. 7 victims. By now, the pattern should have been undeniable. But shame and silence fractured the information across plantations and jurisdictions. The victims met privately, traded rumors, but could not admit what connected them. They knew they were being targeted by someone who understood their houses, their routines, their vulnerabilities. They could not say why. Silas had refined his method over years. During daylight work, he studied the layout of each plantation house. Which windows fit loosely, which doors used old locks, where keys were kept. He learned patrol schedules, floorboards that betrayed weight, rooms where servants slept. And he learned that many plantation houses, grand as they appeared, were secured with devices meant more to exclude enslaved people than to stop someone who knew how to move quietly. He escaped his nightly confinement with tools he was trusted to carry. Locks were simple. Wood yielded to patience. Once inside, he worked with confidence. His victims were rendered unconscious quickly. A cloth soaked in chloroform, stolen in small amounts from plantation medical supplies, placed over the mouth and nose. Brief resistance, then stillness. The castrations were fast, clean, surgical. Silas did not want them dead. Death would invite too much attention. He wanted them to live, to remember. Then he would return to his shed and wait for dawn. By early 1844, Danina could no longer carry what she knew alone. She approached Reverend Thomas Clayton, a Presbyterian minister known, quietly, as a man who spoke cautiously about the moral rot of slavery. She asked for a private meeting. In the Hammond Plantation Chapel, she told him fragments. She did not name Silas at first. She described a man who moved between plantations, a man who could not speak, a man who entered locked rooms, a man exacting revenge. Clayton understood what she could not say outright. He faced a choice with no clean path. To report this would condemn Danina, likely kill her. It would also deliver Silas to the gallows. But Clayton had enough clarity to see that this was not ordinary crime. It was retaliation for sustained, systematic abuse. He chose silence. Instead, he began to listen. Under the guise of ministry, he traveled between plantations, gathering whispers, confirmations, patterns. He learned Silas's name, learned how his voice was taken, learned what men did to him when they thought no one could hear. Clayton kept journals, careful, encoded. In August 1844, he wrote, I have learned the identity of the man they seek. He is called Silas. I have learned what was done to him as a boy of 13. I have learned what was done to him again and again. God forgive me. I cannot condemn him. Clayton's inquiries drew attention. By summer, he was summoned before a committee of concerned citizens and warned to stop asking questions that threatened the social order. He appeared to comply, but he kept writing. Silas continued his work, unaware that the pattern was being seen. By 1847, he was 32 years old, thin, hollowed. Those who saw him said he looked like someone already half gone. The eighth attack came in March 1847. Jonathan Caldwell, wealthy, politically powerful, arrogant enough to believe himself untouchable. Caldwell borrowed Silas for a month-long project, oversaw his confinement personally, visited him repeatedly at night. But something was different this time. The duration, the isolation, the repetition. On the night of March 24th, Silas did not wait. When Caldwell finished and turned away, Silas struck him with a hammer, hard enough to stun, not kill. He bound him, gagged him, lit every candle in the workshop, and then he took his time. This was not efficiency. This was meaning. When it was done, Silas unlocked the door and walked away. He did not hide. He went to the river and waited. At dawn, he was found there, hands stained with blood, face empty. He did not run. He was arrested. Under interrogation, he confessed. 8 victims, 8 nods. When Reverend Clayton asked if they had hurt him, Silas nodded. When asked if they forced themselves on him, he nodded again. There was no defense under law, so the truth was buried. Silas was found dead in his cell 2 days before execution. Officially, a suicide. Unofficially, unanswered. He was buried in an unmarked grave. The plantation system collapsed years later. But the silence remained. Silas left no monument, only a story that survived because someone refused to let it disappear. And maybe that is the most unsettling part. Not that he existed, but that he was never alone.